Well, welcome to the video. Thanks for coming back. Those of you who watched the Genesis rundown from worst to best, and Springsteen the same, I hope you enjoyed the videos. I've got a lot of good feedback on them, great comments. Really enjoyed reading those comments and responding to them. And it made me reflect a little bit about why these videos are maybe useful or interesting to people. Certainly for me as the person making them. What it does for me, it makes me think about all the record collection that I've acquired over the years. It makes me think for a short period of time perhaps, to think about one particular band or an artist and to just focus in on that and really try and just appreciate what it is over the years I've enjoyed from their music and what I've disliked. Now, when I came to doing Genesis and Bruce Springsteen, it wasn't that difficult to have in my mind which are the albums that are the most interesting and enjoyable and which ones were much less so. There's something about Springsteen and Genesis that doesn't apply to the artist I'm talking about today, which is Van Morrison. Van Morrison, I can't do a rundown of all of his albums because nobody will watch it because he's done over 40 now. And at the time of me recording this, tomorrow there's a scheduled delivery of his very latest album, which will be the 42nd or 43rd studio album, I think it is. And that's not including all the best songs and greatest hits, things like that. But Van Morrison, in all these years, in these 50 years, or if you go back to them in the 60s, earlier 60s, I don't think he's made a bad album. And so it's rather tricky to try and identify which are genuinely head and shoulders above the others. Now, I know there's a music journalist groupthink that applies when it comes to Van Morrison. They all think Astral Weeks is far and away the best album. And it's outstanding, no question about it. But every list of the top 50, top 100, top 200 albums, top 500 albums, whenever you see Van Morrison near the top, you're always talking about Astral Weeks. But he's done much more than Astral Weeks over the years. And so I'm going to cover music from every period that he's done in selecting my top 10. Now, I've split Van Morrison's music into three distinct phases. The first phase, I think largely when he'd moved to America, it was he's very thinking about or singing about kind of feelings of nostalgia for his hometown, but also embracing the Californian culture and so on. And I think orally the music of that period, the albums are quite dense. And there's something about his voice in that period. I read it in an interview not too long ago that when he was singing in the early years, he had a bit of a higher pitch to his voice. And I describe it almost like a little dog yelping. So when you see live shows or hear live shows from the period, you can hear him yelping at certain stages. And what he decided to do is to sing more from the stomach. Now, I don't know anything about musical technicality, as it were, so I can't speak with any real authority on this. But apparently, if you sing more from the stomach, that it protects your vocal cords. And that made, in my judgment, that made his second and later period, where his voice was much more resonant, slightly deeper, kind of more rounded in a way, and that yelping disappeared for the better, in my judgment. So the second phase of Van Morrison's music, less dense, but much more around spirituality. Now, I don't know that much about Van Morrison, and the reason being is that someone bought me this book years ago, and another friend of mine had read this and said, don't read it if you like Van Morrison. And my question was, well, why? It's because he comes across as a really difficult, sometimes really nasty character. And that if you read this book, you won't like him or his music anymore. So that's been sitting on the shelves now for about 10 or 15 years, unread. Nevertheless, during this middle period, this search for spirituality, or he took his one famous album, No Guru, No Method, No Teacher, which I'll talk about. It seems at the time that he was going through different kind of sub-phases of searching for a certain spiritual path, and he tapped into Christianity, and he tapped into Buddhism, and he tapped into other stuff as well. Transcendental meditation, I think out in California, I think that's where it started. But as I say, I am not an anorak on Van Morrison the man, much more around, I'm interested in his music. Anyway, so this period where he's chasing the spiritual path was towards the end of the 70s and throughout the 80s and the early part of the 1990s. And then he moved into what I think is his final period, where he started to go back to his R&B and jazz roots. And a lot of his albums became a bit wallpaperish, quite frankly. There are so many of these damn albums. They come so fast, is that it's really hard to grasp on any one in particular and say, this is a real return to form, as the music journalists sometimes describe it as, an album as. So 3 great periods. Also what I find is that his albums, his music, his recordings sound superb almost throughout his career. The them stuff is very mono style, and it's not that well polished for obvious reasons, and it doesn't matter, of course. But once he got into his solo stuff, his music became much more polished, and his recordings really outstanding. So they sound absolutely delicious. They're gorgeous sounding albums. And I think when it comes to, in the Springsteen video, I talked about the early albums and about Springsteen's Greetings from Asbury Park and The Wild, the Innocent and the E Street Shuffle, the first 2 albums being very dense in terms of lyrics. And Springsteen himself, when he was talking about his latest album, Letter to You, on the interviews, he talked about those albums, his desire to move away from the label he was getting was as being the new Bob Dylan. But actually, I think Springsteen at the time was the new Van Morrison, because his music has much more in common with early Van Morrison than it did with Dylan. But that's for another discussion, shall we say. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk through what I think, or what I consider to be the top 10 albums. So let me just take a pause. So number 10 is this one, Into the Music, 1979. Now, like a lot of young lads, and presumably women too, who are interested in the music, I joined a record club, and I had to buy records one a month or something like that, and they were probably a little bit more expensive, but I could pay for them in installments. And when it came towards the end of the 1970s, I didn't know anything about Van Morrison other than Brown Eyed Girl, but I used to read the NME and the Melody Maker and Sounds in the UK, and they used to always go on about Van Morrison's the guy you need to hear. He's kept being lauded as a fantastic songwriter and singer. Now, of course, as I've already mentioned, all this yelping business, when I first started to hear him, it kind of put me off a little bit. But this particular album has retained its place in my top 10, because it's got Bright Side of the Road on it, and The Healing Has Begun, and other tracks that are well worth hearing. It's kind of distinctive in my judgment, because it sounds like a 45-minute version of Bob Dylan's Hurricane. And you know Hurricane, of course, and it's got that violin wailing away in the background all the way through. And this album's a little bit like this. The dominant instrument is violin. But this was the step, almost a bridge from that early phase into the more, what I described as the spiritual phase, where the music became more polished sounding. So that's my number 10, Into the Music, recommended. Now, I've already said that the last period where he's been producing these R&B and jazz style albums, one a year for God knows how long, most of them are pretty not very distinctive. shall I say. But this one is shaping up to be one of the best. 3 Chords and the Truth. Now, it's kind of a return to the theme of spiritual searching and nostalgia, of course. It is, I can't really say hand on heart, this is going to really stand up against his very best. But compared to everything else I've heard in the last 20 years from Van Morrison, this really does stand out. It's a beautiful double album, sounds absolutely great. Dark Night of the Soul, You Don't Understand, he's whinging again, as he has a reputation for how the music press have treated him over the years. Early Days and Days Gone By, tapping into nostalgia. That's definitely worth hearing, so great album. 10, 9, 8. It's too late to stop now. Van Morrison live. Now, I've seen him a handful of times. There's something about Van Morrison live that I don't particularly like. And he has this approach to, I mean, it's hit and miss. It's a bit like Bob Dylan when you see him live. If you're in the right mood and you click, it just sounds absolutely great. Yeah, it's a great experience. But other times you're kind of thinking, halfway through the concert, this is kind of meandering. It's not really going anywhere. And the thing I don't like about Van Morrison live is that he's a craftsman in his music. If you listen to his studio albums, particularly during the 1980s, but that's not necessarily the case. If you listen to it, they're beautifully crafted. They're beautifully crafted. So they sound great, as I've already said. The pace of them can be sometimes extraordinarily slow and calming, and you're kind of tuning in almost to the near silence of some of his work. And you've got the upbeat stuff as well, of course. Now live, he tends to speed everything up, and there's been a couple of concerts in particular back in the late 70s in Newcastle, and then in 2017 I think it was in Bristol Colston Hall, where it just felt he just wanted to get the whole thing over with. Enjoyable, of course, but if you like some of the slower material, it doesn't sound so great when it's speeded up. I saw him in Buxton Opera House at one point, and probably about 10 years earlier, in the early 2000s, and there he was absolutely outstanding. Anyway, I am meandering here myself. So this is almost like a greatest hits of the early years. Some fantastic tracks on that, and on this album, uncharacteristically, as I compared to what at least I've just said, he can slow the pace down very, very nicely, and nothing seems rushed on this album. It's a really well crafted album, and people reckon that this is one of the best live albums of all time, and I wouldn't really argue with that, because it really sounds alive. It's a great album. So very good. My number 8. Talking about Buxton in Derbyshire and the Opera House. I'd heard, as I've already said, that he's a bit of a difficult character, and as me and my other half went up to the venue, we got there early and decided to go to the pub to grab a bite to eat and a drink. And as we were walking into the pub, in what was the snug in a small room in the bar, sitting on his own was Van Morrison. And you know, like any fan, you see an artist that you like, and you kind of think, well, at least say hello and looking forward to the gig or something like that. But he's got such a reputation, and we made eye contact. He looked up from, might have been half a pint of Guinness or something like that. He looked up, and it was almost, he gave me a look which was kind of said, "Don't." Don't speak to me. So I remember just easing past the doorway and leaving him on his own, and thinking, I wonder what if I'd spoken to him, whether he would have been nice or something. I don't really know. Anyway, 10, 9, 8, number 7. This one, A Sense of Wonder, possibly one of the worst album covers of all time, of course, but absolutely beautiful sounding album. The title track itself is utterly gorgeous, and really tapping into that that spirituality thing that was really starting to take over his music. Evening Meditation, is the Master's Eyes, Let the Slave, A New Kind of Man. This is a great sounding album. I don't know whether the critics would say this is up there with his best, but it's one of the handful I keep going back to after all these years. So this one was 1984. So yeah, A Sense of Wonder. Really nice album. Number 6 could have been my number 1. Poetic Champions Compose. It's rather than the violin, and on this occasion, it's the saxophone that dominates this album. So it's got 2 or 3 instrumentals, but it's some absolute classics. The Mystery's fantastic. I Forgot That Love Existed. The best version I've ever heard of the traditional Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. Utterly beautiful, fantastic. Someone Like You, and then the up-tempo Give Me My Rapture and Did You Get Healed towards the end of the album. That is an absolute brilliant album. Sounds great. Probably a Sunday morning or a late night album. Fabulous. Really good. So there we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Number 5 in the list. The music journalists won't like me. Astral Weeks. Now, Astral Weeks. One thing about Van Morrison's music in the 80s and the 90s, if you were having one of these proverbial dinner parties and you want to put some music on in the background, not only is the music is great and it repays your attention. So if you really focus on listening and following the lyrics, and by the way, these, if you like Van Morrison, these are excellent books. Lit Up Inside and Keep It Lit, books of his lyrics. You really can appreciate how much of a poet he really is. So they're fantastic. But anyway, back to dinner parties and listening to background music. A lot of his albums can sound great in that environment. This is not one of them. This is, I would describe it as a difficult album, but it's a brilliant album. The individual tracks don't sound so great on random play when you're driving in the car, or you're just sitting around listening to music in the background at home. But if you sit and concentrate and follow this and give this album your whole attention, it really repays dividends. It is a fantastic album, and when you think about it, this was made in the late 60s. I think he was influenced. I can imagine him being influenced by the Blue Note records, jazz records, because one thing about Blue Note is that in the 50s and the early 60s, their sound was just awesome. It was crystalline. You could hear every instrument very, very clearly, and it's the same here. You can listen to this time and time again, each time perhaps concentrating on a different instrument to really appreciate it. This is a great album. It's mesmerizing, but you have to listen to it with full attention, otherwise it's unsatisfying. And still, it's everyone's number 1, at least, well, not me. So number 4, possibly the peak of his spiritual searching. No guru, no method, no teacher. Not a bad track on this album. In the Garden, fantastic. Thanks for the Information, where I think he's railing against the different people who are trying to set themselves up for gurus to him and his cohort. Got to Go Back. One Irish Rover, Ivory Tower. Yeah, A Town Called Paris. That is possibly the peak of his spiritual stuff. This was the 1986 Before Poetic Champions Compose. Fabulous album. Top 3. Moondance. So this album here, this is like a greatest hits studio style from the early years. Every track here stands up. There's not a bad track on this album. There's not even a mediocre track on this album. But you got And It Stoned Me, Moondance, Crazy Love, Caravan, Into the Mystic. I mean, 5 absolutely fantastic tracks on side 1. Come Running, These Dreams of You, which was a big hit for him, relatively speaking. Brand New Day, Everyone in Glad Tidings. That sounds amazing. It is full of fantastic tracks. And the words, when you go back or go into the books to sit there and appreciate them afresh without the music, you can see it was real poetry. So that's an absolutely fantastic album. So the runner-up for me in the top 10 Van Morrison albums is nowhere near the top of anybody else's, I think. And that's Common One. 1980, I believe it was. This is like an ambient album. Definitely late night. I can just see an impression there. £1.65. So it didn't cost me a lot of money either. Haunts of Ancient Peace. When Heart is Open. Summertime in England. When Heart is Open, it's got fantastic bass guitar or upright bass on it, I suspect. Sounds utterly great. Late night Van Morrison. There's got a couple of more up-tempo tracks on it, but it's dominated by the slow, ambient, atmospheric, where the trumpet and the flugelhorn really come to the fore. Absolutely fantastic album. This is definitely not a dinner party album either. This is another one that requires concentration if you're going to get the best out of it. But that's the runner-up in my top 10 Van Morrison albums. Urge there's one thing about it. I sometimes talk to people about music, and one of the things that I sometimes say is that there are it's maybe a false dichotomy, but there are kind of two ways of consuming music. One is hearing music, and the second is listening to music. And I sometimes say when hearing music is like it's on the radio, it's on the car stereo, it's maybe in the background on the CD player at home, and you're drifting in and out of the room, and you're hearing it, and it's pleasurable in the background. And then there's really listening to music, like you're going to a classical concert, where you sit there in silence and you concentrate only on the performance that's happening in front of you, either at a concert hall or, of course, on your hi-fi system at home, if you've got one. And this is the sort of album that requires you to listen to the music, just like Astral Weeks. Van Morrison's best album, in my judgment. I know a lot of people don't like this album, but it's my favourite. Hymns to the Silence. I think 1991 this came out. Now, a lot of people criticise Van Morrison because he's always a complainer. He complains about the press, he complains about fan intrusion, he complains about people who do him over in his business dealings, and there's plenty of that on here. I mean, he sings about professional jealousy, I'm not feeling it anymore, why must I always explain, which sounds absolutely gorgeous, but he's whinging about journalists who keep asking him the same damn questions in every interview over the years. Just great though, great. If you can get past this idea of him being a curmudgeon, it just sounds great. It sounds absolutely gorgeous. You've got on here different tracks that represent his interest in, I think, Christianity at the time. So there's a certain gospel feel to this album as well. It's very varied, double album, of course. But what really makes this album for me, what makes it the best for me, are the much more meditative tracks, which you probably picked up already. It's kind of what really attracts me to his music. The title track is about 8 minutes. It's absolutely gorgeous. Hymns to the Silence. On Hindford Street is just a poem, but with some ambient sounds in the background, keyboard sounds in the background, nothing much happening at all, a little bit of strumming a guitar towards the end. But he just evokes this period of being a young teenager or even younger on the outskirts of Belfast, as It has echoes for me of my upbringing in Newcastle upon Tyne, where the landscape on the edge of the city is kind of industrial or becoming post-industrial, a bit ramshackle, but a lot of nature around as well. And he writes so evocatively of that experience of being a young person out with your mates and doing simple things like riding a bike and going fishing and whatever. There's something similar as well when he talks about sings about pagan streams. This poetic approach to the music, this ambient style. But as I say, it's got plenty of up-tempo tracks on this album as well, and it's kind of overlooked, a little bit like Prince's Emancipation, the triple album he released, I think in the 1990s. But this is a double album, but it's hard to get, certainly hard to get on vinyl these days, because for some reason Van Morrison allowed a lot of his albums on CD and vinyl to be deleted. So a lot of his older CDs are kind of tricky to get. This is quite kind of difficult to get as well. But I absolutely love this album, and it's a greatest hits that isn't the greatest hits, if you know what I mean. So that is my favourite Van Morrison album. I'd love to hear what you think about that selection of the top 10. And indeed, I'm sure that people will express their own opinions about what their own favourites are. But when you think about Van Morrison as his overall career, one word keeps coming back to me, or two words. One is consistency, and two is inspiration. You really can get a sense that someone is trying to say something important in his music, and he does it in such a way that you can pick any album from the collection and you can find that there are no real bad tracks. There are no bad tracks. They're just tracks that are particularly outstanding, but they're all enjoyable in their own way. So Van Morrison, one of my favorite artists, even though as a live experience, kind of mediocre, but that's just my opinion. I'm sure people will disagree with that. So that's Van Morrison. So I'll do another one of these at some point when I get my head around. This time I've made a little bit of a list to get me to think about, well, what would be interesting to do. So I'm going to have a go at another 2 or 3 of these in due course. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed me talking about Van Morrison. I hope it's inspired you to pick up some albums from his collection or from your own collection, and maybe pick up 1 or 2 albums for the first time in a while. And you never know, you might enjoy them with a greater appreciation than perhaps you'd given them earlier as you collected them. But anyway, that's me done for now, and I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.